While on paper it is very open season for any Southeast Asian national team player who has gained a sufficient number of caps to come out of their home nation to play in the bigger and better league, primarily in Thailand and Malaysia, it doesn't always mean that the grass is always greener on the other side. It may not be the case. Sometimes it's probably a case of being exposed, but getting a better education, feeling better on the better part of it. But ultimately, it's still on the owners of the clubs in Thailand and Malaysia to decide what best to do with them. The ongoing 2025-26 pre-season transfer window in Southeast Asian leagues region-wide has been nothing short of intriguing. For many players from different Southeast Asian nations are moving beyond their home nations, but not to Europe, Japan or Korea, but instead to another top flight in a different Southeast Asian country apart from their country of residence or the international team that they represent. And what is pretty intriguing is, instead of just limiting to just a few nations, then as that was the case in the past, in which I will elaborate on the history of such intra-regional movements later in this clip. This time around, it involves almost all the Southeast Asian nations in the map. And for this aspect, I am actually excluding Australia, even though they are an ASEAN Football Federation member, to provide the simple clarity on the intra-regional movements that is happening in several of the top divisions here. So, without further ado, Tanya attempts to explore what makes this phenomenon of intra-Southeast Asian transfers so unique and intriguing, and possibly set to continue in the next few transfer windows within this region. And actually during this particular pre-season transfer window, there have been a few very notable trends that have emerged among many movements that have taken place in Southeast Asian leagues region-wide. The first one is actually yet another Singaporean exodus, this time once again to Thailand, where several of them are joining the Fundy siblings and one or two other established Singaporean players in filling up the now unlimited ASEAN player quota in the Thai League 1 clubs. Secondly, Kuching City, a Malaysian Super League club based in Sarawak, they have signed their first ever Timor-Leste player, João Pedro, who is actually born in that country itself, thus making him the second Timor-Leste born player to play in a different Southeast Asian league outside of his country of birth after his international teammate joined Tanjong Pagar United in the recent 24-25 Singapore Premier League campaign. And for the first time ever, Selangor actually signed a Thai player. Yes, this had taken place previously predominantly with Pahang and occasionally a few other clubs in among them Perlis, where they have signed Thai players before. But this is the first time ever that Selangor have signed a Thai player, and they have signed a current international in Picha Ultra who came on a free transfer from Thai League 1 side Muang Thong United. And stating only these few among very intriguing intra-regional transfers, Tadija attempts to find out what makes these transfers possible these days, particularly in this pre-season transfer window ahead of the 25-26 season, which is set to kick off in most of the Southeast Asian top flight divisions in August this year. So when we talk about the intra-ASEAN transfers within the domestic top flights, we have to look into context on how the players choose to move abroad. And this is particularly noticeable in the Malaysian Super League and Thai League One, the two major Southeast Asian leagues in the region, and also the only two Southeast Asian leagues that have their representative in the Asian top club competition, AFC Champions League elites. And in this case, they also happen to be the only ones who have the ASEAN quota. And this ASEAN quota allows clubs in the top divisions of these two nations to sign players within the region to bolster their ranks and to give wider Southeast Asian exposure, particularly to the native-born players. When I say native-born players, that means players who are born in their home countries that are in Southeast Asia. And later on in this clip, I'm going to also further divide these Southeast Asian players into your native-born and your heritage or naturalized players to differentiate and to explain on the pros and cons on having these intra-regional transfers in Southeast Asia, especially in these two leagues in the region. So when we look at the intra-Southeast Asian transfer moves within the region itself, this looks like a rather new phenomenon because it involves more Southeast Asian nations than ever before. It is actually not a new phenomenon. It is not a new fad or trend that's happening in this region where it always has this habit of always catching on to the latest fads or trends from other football influences around the world. But in this case, it is actually not so. In fact, these intra transfers have begun as far back as the 1980s. Yes, the 1980s, when we talk about modern football, where it all began actually from the early 1980s when, ironically, Singaporeans were the first ones to make the moves abroad within the region. When Tambia Pamanathan and R. Suriamurthy became the first Singaporean players to move from Singapore to a Malaysian club when they joined Pahang after Singapore withdrew from the Malaysian Cup between 1982 to 1985. So they became the first two Singaporean players to move to a different Southeast Asian league, albeit to Malaysia. And around at the same period, Fandi Ahmad and David Lee Soon Chai became the first Singaporean players to play in a different Southeast Asian nation apart from their immediate neighbours. In this context, Nyak Mitra of Indonesia, who are later known as Pelita Jaya and now Madura United. And this intra-regional movements became much more pronounced in 1989 when Malaysia became the first league to officially allow foreigners to be registered in their domestic league competition in what was known as the Liga Semi-Pro League Division 1. And with not just the influx of Australian players who came to play in Malaysia in that period, by then there were already a number of Singaporean players who were already playing for different Malaysian state teams in the peninsula, whether it was Ahmad Paijan and Nasir Jalil of Terengganu, or later the Singaporean trio of Malik Awab, Fandi again, and K. Kanan, who helped Kuala Lumpur win 3 successive Malaysian Cups between 1987 and 1989, or even the odd move to Johor as well, and also the Pahang stalwarts in Suria who stayed in the club for quite a while along with Terry. But when the floodgates opened for the Malaysian League in 1989, players from Thailand, Myanmar, and occasionally Indonesia, they began to pour into the Malaysian top flights. From the late 1980s, where they had Pia Papuong, Atapo Buspakom, who played for Pahang in the late 80s to the early 90s. Then you also had, for in the period of time, Win Ong, Neo Hyang Win, who played in Singapore, who played for the Singapore team in the Malaysian League. And if I'm not wrong, another Myanmar player also played for Perak in the Malaysian top flight. So then the Indonesians came along a little later, particularly in 2005 when Selangor actually signed the Indonesian top duo of Elie Aiboy and Bambang, who became club cult heroes for their attacking flair and prolific goal scoring rate for the Red Giants, as they swept a number of trophies in that period when they were playing for them. So, and outside of the Malaysian League, Singapore actually enjoyed an influx of Thai players, particularly the members of that golden 1990s generation when the likes of Surachai Jatuh Pataparampong, Tawan Suripan, Niwet Sirong, Kadisuk Sena Muang, and Desak Chaiman Suti Susongkip, and other Tabachai Damrong Ontraku, and other Thai players all joined the Singapore League clubs in the early years of the Singaporean Professional League, the S League, now known as the Singapore Premier League, from 1998 all the way towards the end of the 2000s. There was such a strong Thai contingent in Singapore because partially it was related to then Singapore having such a large group of Thai foreign workers at that period, and Thai foreign workers being very hungry to see their local heroes in action. They have their fair share of having seen their national heroes in a number of neighborhood stadiums in Singapore at the peak of the Singapore League at that period. And at the same time, it wasn't just about the exodus of the Thai stars to the Singapore League. There were, as I mentioned earlier, also in the late 2000s, after Noor Alam Shah made some strongly worded comments on the state of the Singapore League in 2009, that actually sparked a number of Singaporean players to actually make the exodus to Indonesia, with Alam Shah and Ridwan Muhammad starring for Arema Malang, Farudin Mustafij, Precious Imujirai playing for Persija Jakarta, Precious eventually moving on to Sriwijaya, and I think if I'm not wrong, Khairul Amri, Syarul Ishak play for Persiba Balikpapan, and also by Haki Kaizan playing for Persija as well. So it sparked a brief wave of Singaporean players moving to Indonesia at that period. And as Vietnam began to grow economically and could afford the wages that the Thai players were craving for, Vietnam even got into the act with the V-League offering lucrative contracts, which enticed a number of Thai players to actually jump from Singapore or even from the Thai League to the V-League in a period, led by Kadisuk Senamong himself, who played for Huang An Gia Lai as their leading player in that decade, along with a few other players, Thai international stars, including the Sak, who moved to Vietnam for that period before returning to Singapore to play for SCMFC in the late 2000s. Then, in the past decade, within not just beyond Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Myanmar, and Vietnam, although it's one-way street for Vietnam and Malaysia, the net began to cast wider, especially with the new trend of heritage players who are born overseas but having a player from Southeast Asian descent, whether it's a Malaysian, Indonesian, a parent or a grandparent, the relaxed FIFA rules on naturalization, and also in one or two Southeast Asian nations that allow dual nationality as long as they have proven heritage, especially from the Philippines, we see a sudden influx of Southeast Asian internationals playing for various leagues in the region, and that saw the explosion of movement within the region. And it's not just the foreign-born players who became national team players for various Southeast Asian nations that joined the bandwagon. Laos became one of the newer nations in the region to actually join the flood of intra-regional transfers, with the Laotian players predominantly moving to Thailand, and your Philippine diaspora players seeking new opportunities found themselves wanted as foreign players in the region itself. And a number of them are still holding on strong in the Southeast Asian leagues today, including Neil Attridge, the English-born goalkeeper. You got Dion Koos, who recently transferred from Buriram United to J1 League side Cerezo Osaka, and a number of other players, particularly from Philippines, who actually end up moving from the clubs of their origin, whether in Europe and all that, but they have represented Philippines and others or other Southeast Asian nations, and they decided to capitalize on that opportunity to move to the top Southeast Asian leagues in the region. And for Malaysia in particular, going back to Malaysia, after Singaporean representative side Lions 12 took part in the Malaysian Super League between 2012 to 2015, it saw more Singaporeans moving abroad. After the Malaysia phase in the 80s to the Indonesian move in the late 2000s and early 2010s, to now moving to Thailand, moving to other Malaysian clubs after the closure of Lions 12 in 2015, that saw more players branching out to seek greener pastures in higher levels leagues who can afford to pay higher salaries than what their home countries have to offer. Although there's a rather curious phenomenon in all this, when it comes to Southeast Asian nations, where you have players from Timor-Leste, even Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, they're all moving out. Two Southeast Asian nations in particular have rarely made moves outside of their home nation to another Southeast Asian league. Former Vietnam under-21 player Ho Tun Tan transferred from his home nation to Singaporean club side Balestier Khalsa earlier this season for the latter half of the 24-25 Singapore Premier League campaign. Although he did not make any appearance in the competition, he became the first Vietnamese player to move within Southeast Asia when he moved from Vietnam to Singapore, which was rather curious because for Malaysia and Vietnam in particular, they have a lot of foreign workers outside football in the diaspora who move abroad for better economic opportunities, for better wages, for better exposure, but the footballers happen to be the opposite. Vietnam is one. Malaysia, native-born players. I mean, we do not talk about those heritage or naturalized players in this context. Apart from Safi Salih, who moved to an Indonesian club in the late 2000s, and Dominic Tan, the current Harimau Malaya defender, who played for BEC or Police Tero in the past decade, briefly on loan from Johor Darul Takzim. No other Malaysian player has moved beyond their domestic league, to play in the different Southeast Asian nations, which I admit they are the ones who are bucking the trend when it comes to moving abroad, and it's pretty possible that for them, they feel that their leagues provide enough wages for them to stay within their comfort zone, to stay within their own leagues, where otherwise, if they had moved abroad, they might have to take a pay cut, and also they are possibly not guaranteed playing opportunities as well. So it's a very touch and go situation, especially in the part that I just mentioned, which I will elaborate more when we discuss on having the pros and cons of having Southeast Asian players moving within the region to get better playing opportunities. And before I go there, I will now talk a little bit about the ASEAN quota, which so far only the Thai and only the Malaysian and Thai top flights have introduced. For the Malaysian Super League, they actually first introduced the ASEAN quota back in 2018, when they offered this slot for Southeast Asian player to venture to give these players within the region who have represented their national teams for the region to play in the Malaysian top flight. And it's not just the Singaporeans who benefited from this, as I've also mentioned, the Myanmar players also benefited from this as well, sparking a second wave of Myanmar players moving from Myanmar to Malaysia after the 1990s, where they had some of the golden generation of players who made the move in the same direction in that period. Although in this time slightly bigger, small but still slightly bigger than previous, even though Myanmar players have also now made moves to Thailand as well. Then from the upcoming season onwards, Malaysia allow for up to 2 ASEAN player slots in the Malaysian Super League, and quite a number of clubs have begun to utilize this concept to try and get at least one Southeast Asian player to fill up this roster, and potentially even foreign-born heritage naturalized players. In this case, they can also fill up that Southeast Asian spot, provided they have had another passport or have represented a Southeast Asian nation in international competitions. So Thailand also actually have this same concept also that same year in 2018, when they first allow for 1, before subsequently expanding the ASEAN quota to 3 in the early part of this decade, before announcing that from the upcoming 25-26 season onwards that there will be an unlimited quota of ASEAN players. Unlimited. That means you can have or AFF players. That means not just from the ASEAN region plus Timor-Leste, but also Australians who can fill up this quota in unlimited numbers. Although there is still a limit on how many foreign players they can fill on match days. But signing the players en masse is not so difficult these days. That's why there are more Singaporeans moving from Singapore to from the Singapore Premier League to the Thai League 1, and also possibly more players from other nationalities doing the same as well. Now, moving on to the next point, the pros and cons of having ASEAN players playing in a different ASEAN league outside of their country of birth or country of representation. I think and in this case I will break down even further. It's not just your ASEAN players. You have your native borns, those who are born, bred, raised, educated, live, breathe, slept football in their home nation throughout their lives. And the second category is for the foreign-born players, the heritage and the naturalized players, where they have spent much of their younger days in their country of birth, where they have spent much of their football education overseas outside of this region before coming to Southeast Asia to ply their trade or to play for a different nation because of parental heritage or through the naturalization process. So in this context, I may focus a lot more on the native-born Southeast Asians. Why are more Southeast Asians willing to move abroad to the bigger leagues within the region? The first thing is obviously they're pretty cheap market value wise. Transfer fees in Southeast Asia are still quite rare these days because clubs in Southeast Asia still operate on you can say 1 year contract, 2 year contracts. Transfer windows are very few and far between. It's usually agent fees that decide the transfer of the player from say his native nation in Club A to a foreign nation in a foreign Southeast Asian nation in Club B. And in the process of moving, once the contract expires, usually foreign agent gets involved and he gets a share of the proceedings, not through a transfer fee but possibly through other methods such as perhaps paying a portion of the player's salary to the agent himself. Yeah, so there's still no established practice of a transfer fee involved because it is not like in Europe or even in Japan, Major League Soccer, or South America, where transfer fees are more pronounced and they provide massive income for those clubs that export the players, not import. And usually those who import the players worldwide, they come from the smaller core of the elite clubs in the top 5 European leagues. So in this context, transfer fees are still largely non-existent in Southeast Asia. They come after free transfers after they have finished their contracts with their previous clubs or through mutual termination. So for native Southeast Asians, they are cheaper to get. For the overseas born Southeast Asian internationals, it is an opportunity for them to create value by moving to these high profile Southeast Asian leagues, mainly Thailand and Malaysia, occasionally Indonesia, so that they can continue to play first team football and be seen as a foreign player in these lands. But for native Southeast Asians, it's relatively a lot cheaper. And number two, why do they move abroad? The Thai league, the Malaysian league, they offer good salaries, usually in the 5-figure regions. Although for those who play for smaller clubs in Thailand or Malaysia, usually in the better 4-figure region, usually in US dollars. Yes, US dollars. Why not Singapore? In this case, the region's leading economic power. Actually, it's pretty simple. Unlike its economy, Singapore's football is very third world. So third world that you can say many of the players who play in the Singapore League, local players who play in the Singapore League, they have to take second jobs to sustain living, and the wages are not that high. A national player in Singapore could get up to 8,000, but that's as good as it gets. When they play overseas, even across the border playing for other clubs, their salaries will usually double, unless they're playing for Lion City Sailors. Usually double, and usually when they're regulars and they get respected more, the way from the days of Fandi Ahmad, V Sundramoorthy, or even Ahmad Paijan at Terengganu, or Hasnim Haron in Johor before Johor FA. These players, when they move, they have to show that they are as good or better than the locals there in Malaysia. Never mind Thailand, where the Thais have a higher skill level than the Singaporeans. But the football economy in Singapore is so negligible that it is always on life support. So that's why the Singaporean players always have this aspiration to move within the region. Yes, they want to leave Singapore because the football in Singapore is that stagnant, but they know that there's a vibrant culture in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. So now coming back, why do Southeast Asian players particularly like to move to Malaysia and Thailand? It's not just because your Johor Darul Taksims and Buriram United are representing these two top leagues, regional leagues in Asia, in the highest level of club competition, but also the value of the overall league. These leagues overall, these two leagues, they are a lot higher than that in compared to the rest of the region. A lot higher. Although Cambodia is catching up, Indonesia are almost there, but persistent issues like salaries and all these are still there. They still persist. So these two leagues offer a higher quality football education, a bigger culture, wider internationalization of the group of players that come to play in those two leagues, and given the ASEAN quota that they have, especially in Thailand, if you're one of the few Southeast Asian players in the one club, they will get appearances because of the quota placed in the starting 11. They will get a chance to play, even though it's going to be the level, especially from Laos, from Cambodia, is a lot higher than what they have seen back in their home domestic league. And and where this is concerned, the ability of these players to expand their football education beyond the confines of their home comfort zone, especially when Thailand, Malaysia are the better known Southeast Asian football nations. And even though Vietnam should be in that category, but as I've mentioned, very rarely do Vietnamese players move abroad to play for another Southeast Asian league. Even though Nguyen Quang Hai and I think Ho Van Duc, another Vietnamese player, they have played abroad, played in Europe for half a season or one season before coming back without making much of a dent in Europe. So having that better exposure, the internationalization, the culture of many different nationalities, it broadens their worldview. So what about another pros of them playing there? Salaries will obviously be better, especially from countries that are pretty economically very challenged, or they are in strife, like Myanmar, who are still embroiled in the civil war, and think for Laos, where economically they are pretty starved or pretty tight. So that's why you have Laotian born players going to Thailand, because Thailand not only provides a wonderful football education, but it gives them a better standard of living compared to what they could receive back home. But at the same time, when I'm talking about it, it's mainly for the native bonds. How about the foreign born Southeast Asian players? The foreign born, that means those who are born outside of Southeast Asia. Usually in this case, they usually come as foreign players first before they become naturalized players. So in their case, they will be wanting to stay in the league, compete in the league that has a certain level of standard that is comparable to what they have gotten back home. In this case, the Thai League 1 fits the bill perfectly, the Malaysia Super League much less so, because at times the disparity is not just about your Johor against the rest, even your Selangor and Terengganu against the rest outside of Johor Darul Taksim could be quite wide as well. But in Thailand, because there's so many Thai players who come from different academies around the country, and they have high technical proficiency, it encourages these foreigners to at least maintain a certain level, a certain standard of play from their football education that they have received earlier in their younger years when they were born elsewhere, outside of the region. And playing in the Thai League gives them the opportunity, especially when they have so many other foreigners who come from usually Spain, usually from other African countries. It gives them the opportunity to keep their game up at a certain level, and particularly against your Burirams and Bangkok BG Patums and your Bangkok Glasses, who have foreigners of a much higher quality than the rest of the league. It gives them that ability to continue to play at a competitive level of a more acceptable standard than it would be elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, that includes the Malaysian Super League outside of Johor Darul Takzim. Now, what about the cons of playing in another Southeast Asian league? For many of those Southeast Asian, especially the native bonds, the biggest challenge is whether they can compete for a place in the starting 11. Filling the registration quota for squad registration is not a problem, but whether they can get meaningful minutes on the pitch is a different matter. It's not just about getting registered, getting quality training in Thailand or to an extent Malaysia, Indonesia, but could they get the minutes for the native bonds? Even in the Malaysian league itself, it's not so straightforward, especially when they are come from a minor nation. Like the Laotian players, they have joined the Thai clubs, but we don't recall them having a lot of minutes in the Thai league. Myanmar players are more fortunate because the Malaysian clubs usually they do rely quite a bit on the foreign signings to do the job, and the Myanmar players will get considerable minutes to play for their respective overseas club in the region. Cambodia, because the Cambodians were moved abroad to other Southeast Asian leagues so far, they are all actually foreign born, so they are likely to get some meaningful minutes of action for their new clubs in outside of their country that they represent. Then what about the Indonesians, the Singaporeans? It's actually quite mixed. Depending on the mood of the clubs in Malaysia and Thailand, they could get minutes or they couldn't, because the last Singaporean player who is still on contract with Selangor, Safwan Baharudin, he is currently in limbo because he's frozen out to the Selangor second team because he's not wanted in the current Selangor head coach plans for the upcoming season. How about other Singaporean players who have gone overseas before? A number of Singaporeans have struggled to get minutes in particularly in Thailand or even in Indonesia at times. But for Indonesia, I'm not talking that much explicitly because usually those who had gone to Indonesia previously, they are talented enough to hold a lot on their own. But in this era, how many will actually become meaningful players, especially when Ilhan Fandi is now at Buriram on loan from BG, Iksan Fandi at Ratchaburi alongside Faik Bokia of Brunei? Will they get enough minutes to show that they are worth the loan transfers? Ilhan possible, Iksan probable. How about Irfan? That's a question mark, because Irfan has spent a bit more time off the field than on the pitch when it comes to his Thailand stint so far, and I don't want to go into details on that. The cons is quite clear. If you're not that good enough, especially for the native bonds, you're not going to get that many minutes, and it will show, especially for some countries who have exported players but they quickly return because they can't get playing opportunities. And one such case will be Zulfami Arifin, who has not gained sufficient minutes in Thailand and Indonesia to make a deep impression in either of the countries where he has played club football at, and is now back at Hougang United in Singapore. And there are many more players in like Zulfami's case where this is concerned. Secondly, unlike the foreign-born Southeast Asian internationals who have had such exposure overseas, especially quite a number of them who have actually played in European club competition before, like Dion Kus, they will have the upper hand where they'll be viewed favorably to those European foreigners, to the South American foreigners, especially when they are faced with competition from your European nations, South America, but predominantly there are Argentinians and Brazilians, your African players, then your Koreans and Japanese players who are also now moving on en masse abroad and into Southeast Asian leagues as well. This is where the native-born Southeast Asians get the short end of the stick compared to the rest. And on that front actually, this is also where the native Southeast Asians have a lot more catching up, because their football education is a lot weaker compared to the foreign-born Southeast Asian internationals, especially those who have been representing as particularly the Indonesian national team and also Malaysia recently, and maybe more Southeast Asian countries could be looking to do the same as well. So that's where they are viewed at compared to the foreign-born Southeast Asian international. So it's not a level playing field. It's a lot more hazardous for the native-born Southeast Asians compared to the foreign-born internationals. Even though it's also no guarantee that foreign-born Southeast Asian internationals will always be starting players in their respective clubs. Not every player is New Attridge or Tiong Kus. Yes, not every player of these two. They have played at a decent quality. The rest, some of them may have, some of them no. They have played in the lower divisions in Europe or elsewhere before coming to Southeast Asia. They might get the short end of the stick as well. So it's no guarantee, because it's up to the whims and fancies of the club owners in these two countries, in these two leagues, to determine whether they make the starting 11 or they're not. And yes, I also forget one more Asian nation that's actually bringing in more foreign players into this part of the world, Uzbekistan. So with such competition in Asia, in Europe, in South America, it is really particularly tough for the native Southeast Asians to make the grade beyond the comfort zone. And I think this is a fact that Malaysians and Vietnamese recognize cognizantly, to be aware that even if unless they are of Quang Hai's level, or if they are of, say, in the local level, Arif Aiman, or previously Shafiq Ahmad, no, there's Safawi Rashid, where they can venture overseas. Otherwise, why would they want to give up their highly paid contracts in their respective domestic leagues just to move abroad, just to get better football education in the region, in Thailand, primarily Thailand, especially for the Malaysians who don't really move abroad from the Mokhtar Dahari times till now, who do not really move beyond the Southeast Asia, apart from a few Malaysian Chinese who moved to Hong Kong in the 1980s, which also included a Singaporean as well in that period. But I'm slightly digressing, but still, it does not suppress the fact that this is what Southeast Asia is facing when it comes to having ASEAN players. While on paper it is very open season for any Southeast Asian national team player who has gained a sufficient number of caps to come out of their home nation to play in the bigger and better league, primarily in Thailand and Malaysia, it doesn't always mean that the grass is always greener on the other side. It may not be the case. Sometimes it's probably a case of being exposed, but getting a better education, feeling better on the better part of it. But ultimately, it's still on the owners of the clubs in Thailand and Malaysia to decide what best to do with them, especially in Thailand, when competition for places will be super fierce, where they are facing your Uzbeks, Koreans or Japanese, Europeans, South Americans, African players who are also in the same club. How to prevail to ensure that they get a place to play on match day, or even sit on the bench on the match day squad. I think this intra-regional movement with more nations involved is getting region-wide. It's getting very interesting and intriguing off the pitch, but on the pitch, would it have the same outcome as well? Which, so far, with the evidence shown in the top two leagues in Southeast Asia, no, not yet. So the jury is actually still wide open on having the ASEAN import quota in Southeast Asian leagues and for ASEAN imports to move from their home countries, to move out of their comfort zones into a different Southeast Asian league, it's still a risk, especially when they're up even against fellow Southeast Asian internationals who are actually born abroad, who have been educated, who have been given their football education abroad. It's not just from against external competition, but also from within the national teams. That's what makes this whole transfer window looks pretty fascinating, and Daniel looks forward to the 25-26 season in domestic season in Southeast Asia, even with the ASEAN Club Championship and the AFC Cup competitions, with much keenness and interest.